Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, good morning.
Regional instability and the preservation of global security is nowhere more evident than in the Arabian Gulf region. This is because Gulf security is ultimately the result of the interaction among different yet interrelated factors. The complexity of the issue itself and the challenges that it presents to all those who deal with Gulf security are greatly enhanced by the fact that here national, regional, and international interests overlap and often compete with each other. Gulf security and stability is and will continue to be threatened by arms proliferation, ethnic and religious tensions, and the social and political dislocation associated with global economic change. The lingering repercussion of recent regional conflicts, as well as the looming threat of additional military confrontations, remain a stark reminder of the fragile stability and security of the area. In assessing the current military security environment in the region, one needs to focus on three fronts. The first is the challenge that Iran and Iraq continue to present toward the Arab Gulf states. The second is the establishment of collaborative efforts among all those states that have a concern in Gulf security. The third is the current security environment and the need to focus on steps to achieve lessening of tensions in order to reduce the likelihood of a possible military confrontation. In this regard, the active participation of the Gulf Cooperation Council states in constructing a broader security paradigm is absolutely essential. The end of the Cold War presents an opportunity to develop a more stable indigenous security paradigm that no longer needs to abide by the unofficial rules of the bipolar system. Such a solution has to ultimately involve all the countries of the Arabian Gulf. In addition, while effective military security remains of paramount importance, a greater degree of emphasis needs to be placed on economic prosperity as a stabilizing factor to establish vigorous and enduring economic and trade relations among the countries interested in maintaining Gulf security. A more interdependent environment needs to be created in order to give all states stake in the preservation of peace. As a whole, the development of a sound and coherent BCC strategy, an effective public policy, the continuing evolvement of economic growth strategies, and broader regional issues such as the Arab-Israeli conflict all have an enormous impact on Gulf security. It is my hope that over the course of the next 2 days, each of us will gain a better understanding of the security determinants which will carry the GCC-UK relationship into the next century. We must be aware that together with the expectations of peace and prosperity, unforeseen challenges are harbored in this new era. It is therefore our task not only to define the present challenges and provide comprehensive responses to them, but also to prepare the groundwork for future security challenges. Thank you very much.
We in the UK are delighted to welcome so many participants from the Gulf Cooperation Council states, especially this morning, Their Excellencies the Foreign Ministers of Bahrain, Oman and Qatar. Because over many years there were close relationships of trust and real friendship between individuals on both sides who worked together to achieve what they believed was worthwhile. Indeed, I believe if you look at the development of relations between the United Kingdom and the Gulf states over the last 180 or so years, such close personal relationships, in my view, have been the most important factor. So if this conference serves to strengthen personal ties between leading figures or create new ties, so that if we're faced with a crisis or a problem in the future, we can deal with each other from both sides on the basis of personal knowledge and acquaintanceship, rather than simply with a name on a piece of paper, then I believe that the effort that everyone has put into this conference, both in preparing for it and attending it, will have been well worthwhile. Gentlemen, that concludes what I wanted to say in terms of welcoming remarks. I wonder if I could just address a small practical issue. The conference was timed to coincide with the meeting in London of the European Union foreign ministers with their GCC counterparts. And when that timing was conceived, it was envisaged that only 3 GCC foreign ministers would be involved, and that was subsequently expanded to embrace all 6 foreign ministers. That has with it advantages and disadvantages from our point of view. It does mean that, sadly, we shall lose for proceedings today His Excellency Yusuf bin Alawi, the Foreign Minister of Oman, and we shall also lose most of the GCC ambassadors. The benefit, I think, is that we shall be able to share, as we are this morning, in some of the events, and in the reception given by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs this evening. What I wanted to say is that the foreign ministers are, of course, extremely welcome to rejoin us when they've finished with their ministerial meeting, both today and for our proceedings tomorrow. And I do hope that they will be kind enough to release their ambassadors to come back to us as quickly as possible. And that will be to our benefit, and whether it's to their benefit, it will be for them to judge at the end of the process. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and again, a warm welcome to the United Kingdom.
Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Royal United Services Institute for Defence Studies, could I welcome you all most warmly to the Institute. We are indeed honoured by your presence. The international security issues concerning the Middle East are at the core of the international security and defence business of the Institute. And in the more than 100 years since the RUSI built this home for the Institute, I believe there have been few occasions when we have combined a topic of such importance as Gulf security with a congregation from the GCC and the United Kingdom of such eminence, and at a time of such manifest opportunity. I'm delighted that the Royal United Services Institute is, in association with the Emirates Centre and the Gulf Consultancy Services, producing this conference. We are very much looking forward to the presentations and discussions during the next 2 days, and our aim is to make your stay with us as pleasant and productive as possible. I will have a few rather routine administrative matters to raise with you in a little while, but for the moment I will thank you and welcome you very much on behalf of the Institute. So thank you.
He's shown a particular interest in Gulf affairs, demonstrated by an unusually high number of visits to the region, and not least, of course, by the readiness rapidly to deploy British forces to the Gulf at the time of the last Iraq crisis. If I may say, I believe he's also shown an instinctive feel for and understanding of the Gulf and its people, which tends to support the belief that between the Arabs and British people of Celtic stock, there is some kind of special chemistry, which those of us who are not of Celtic stock can only envy. He's also shown his support for our active interest in Gulf affairs by being willing to host the final dinner tomorrow night for this conference, and by being kind enough to come this morning to open the conference with his own remarks. Gentlemen, the Secretary of State for Defence, Mr. John Robertson.
Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege indeed to welcome you all here to London for this conference. To see in the audience such a distinguished collection of people, friends that I've made in the last year, and so many other people, including some of the political opposition here, both past and present, and I'm very pleased to see my distinguished predecessor, Mr. Michael Portillo, also at this conference, and I think it does indicate very clearly and quite decisively that the welcome you receive here to London is not just from one political party, one part of this nation of ours, just from this government, comes from the British people as a whole. It's warm and it is wholehearted as well. And his signing, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed himself, the eminent Centre for Strategic Studies and Research, Mr. Tantum introduced me, and the Royal United Services Institute are to be congratulated on bringing together such a distinguished gathering of policymakers and experts in this area. I have no doubt that your discussions will be fruitful, and I and my ministerial colleagues look forward to participating in this conference, and when our other meetings allow, to meeting many of you here in the conference and also in these social occasions around about it. It is this weekend exactly a year since I took office, and I need no persuading of the importance of the topic that you are to consider. The security of the Gulf is vital to the United Kingdom's strategic and economic interests. Those who allege that our main interest lies in defence sales could not be more wrong. The security of the Gulf has figured prominently in our own strategic defence review, and John REID is going to be saying more about that in a few minutes' time. The Gulf has also, along with Bosnia, been at the centre of the operational issues that I personally have had to face in this first remarkable year of the new government. Earlier this year, I took the very serious decision to deploy an aircraft carrier and tornado bombers to the Gulf in order to demonstrate that the United Kingdom was not prepared to stand aside while Saddam Hussein defied the United Nations Security Council over his weapons of mass destruction. Happily, that crisis was resolved without resort to force, but I firmly believe that the decision by the United States, the United Kingdom, and many other members of the international community to deploy forces to the Gulf was an important, maybe even a decisive factor in persuading Saddam to back down. As the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kofi Annan, himself said in Baghdad, I quote, "You can do a lot more with diplomacy when it is backed up by firmness and force." One of the proudest moments of my first year of ministerial office was to come into Portsmouth Harbour on the deck of HMS Invincible with its crew all at attention as it came back to its base port after 7 months away, including that vital and decisive period that it spent in the Gulf as part of coalition forces which forced Saddam to back down. But the potential for further conflict in the Gulf remains clear. Saddam Hussein has shown himself in the past to be ruthless and untrustworthy. He's twice invaded his neighbours and has not only developed weapons of mass destruction, but has made use of his chemical weapon. And that is why we need to remain vigilant to ensure that he complies in full with the obligations laid in Iraq by the United Nations, and why, when our aircraft carrier withdrew from the Gulf earlier this month, I deployed additional tornado bombers to the region and proposed to keep them there for the time being. But I should here emphasise that our quarrel is with Saddam Hussein and his regime, and not with the Iraqi people. We've consistently sought to alleviate their suffering, often in the face of blatant obstruction by Saddam Hussein himself. Earlier this year, this country sponsored Security Council Resolution 1153, which more than doubled the value of the oil for food arrangements. And last week we hosted in London a humanitarian meeting which brought together experts from the United Nations, the European Union, donor countries, and non-governmental organisations to consider how the plight of the Iraqi people themselves can be eased. There are, of course, aspects of Iranian policy too which continue to pose potential risks for the security and the stability of the region, and which need to be watched carefully, notwithstanding the more encouraging words that we have been hearing recently from President Khatami. The government of Iran will be judged by its actions, not simply by its words. I'm conscious above all that the lack of progress in the Middle East peace process has had a destabilising effect on the Gulf. During my recent visits to Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates, I was impressed by the strength of the arguments put to me on this score, and we are very sensitive to these views. This government has made the peace process one of the highest priorities for our European Union presidency, as was well demonstrated by the visits which Prime Minister Blair and Foreign Secretary Robin Cook have made to the peace process countries. Next week, arising from the Prime Minister's visit, we will be hosting a meeting involving the Americans, the Palestinians and the Israelis here in the city of London. No one is under any illusions as to the difficulties that will be needed to overcome and to reinvigorate the peace process, but we remain ready to lend assistance where we can. The United States is of course central both to underpinning Gulf security and to reinvigorating the Middle East peace process. But I believe that the United Kingdom also has a worthwhile role to play, both in its own right and as a trusted ally of the United States, who is able to make a distinctive contribution to the formulation of policy in Washington. Of course, not all threats to security are military in nature, and nor is the use of force always the right response to a threat. As defence policy makers, we are naturally concerned to ensure that we have the policies and capabilities which enable us to cope in the most demanding of circumstances. But I'm also convinced that our armed forces have other significant parts to play in promoting stability and security. The existence of strong, well-equipped, well-trained and properly accountable armed forces is itself a deterrent against aggression. And that deterrence will be all the greater if there is clear solidarity between the nation or nations under threat and their friends, both within the region and outside. That's one of the major lessons that we in the United Kingdom learned from the success of NATO in standing up to the threat over 4 decades from the Warsaw Pact. And as we approach the 50th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty, we can reflect back on just how successful that solidarity between allies has been. I also believe that our service personnel themselves have also a role to play in building trust and reducing the underlying causes of instability. Officers talking together or training together can be an effective way of shaping a peaceful security environment, and the importance of this defence diplomacy, as I have termed it, is one of the major themes of our strategic defence review. I hope there may be scope for exploring the application of some of these ideas to Gulf security during this conference. It's an area where I believe that the United Kingdom, which already has a significant training and advisory presence in the region, is well placed to help. It is, of course, significant that this conference should be taking place in London. During the 2 visits that I've already made to the Gulf, I've been very struck by the fact that the United Kingdom and the GCC states are bound together not only by common interests, but also by ties of history, understanding, and indeed affection. And I myself have been received with great warmth and hospitality wherever I've been and from whoever I've met. Indeed, Sheikh Salam, when we met the other day, was calling me a Scottish sheikh. Sheikh Robinson. I don't know whether it's a bit pretentious for me to take upon myself this description of what they might make of it in my Hamilton constituency. But if it comes from somebody like my friend Sheikh Salam, then I'm sure it must be a great honour. But I've also been struck by the good relations which exist between our military personnel and by the generous support which is provided for the United Kingdom forces in the Gulf. These links provide a firm foundation for continued cooperation and defence in the future. So In these opening remarks, I've naturally given my own perspective on some of the issues that the conference will be addressing. But I and other representatives of Her Majesty's Government very much look forward to hearing from our GCC friends about what you believe the major security problems that will be faced in the future, and how the United Kingdom can assist in addressing them. We very much value the views of our friends, and of course want to take account of all of them in our own policy making. And I therefore encourage you to speak as openly as possible. I can assure you that you are among friends in this place. And with these remarks, therefore, Mr. Chairman, I wish you a stimulating and successful.
The Strategic Defence Review has in many ways been dominating the intellectual existence of the British defence community for the past year. And not least perhaps at the risk of stating the obvious, because the government has been reviewing fundamentally our defence strategy. There have been many inputs to the review from many sources, and we all now in the defence community await the output, about which there has been much speculation, not least in, but not only in, the media. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom defence policy and the implementation of defence, in particular towards the Gulf region, has moved when it has been necessary to do so, as we have indeed just heard from the Secretary of State. To speak to us now concerning the United Kingdom policy and the implications of the United Kingdom Defence Review, I am delighted to be able to welcome to the stand the Minister of State for the United Kingdom Armed Forces, Dr. John Reid.
Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, yet another member, I'm afraid, of the small Celtic tribe that was referred to earlier, though I cannot pretend to aspire to the position of the former Speaker, my immediate boss. I'm afraid I'm only a minor Scottish deputy sheik. You will understand, ladies and gentlemen, that the government, the new Labour government, which was elected last May, was as committed as any previous British government to ensuring that Britain plays a leadership role internationally and to underpin this with strong defence. We are absolutely determined to contribute to wider international peace and security in conjunction, of course, with our allies. Peace and security in the Gulf is of great importance to the United Kingdom, not only because of our strategic and economic and commercial interests in the region, but also because of the presence of a sizable expatriate community, and because, not least, of the close historical and personal contacts between the United Kingdom and the Gulf, contacts which I think have been well fostered over the previous 12 months by the visits of our defence ministers, Lord Gilbert, Secretary of State, and also, if I might say so, with the warm hospitality and friendship which has been extended to them by many of you here today. We greatly value those links, and the government is seeking actively to maintain them in practice as well as in rhetoric. I therefore very much welcome the opportunity to participate today in the conference and to say a few words about United Kingdom policy in the region and the implications of the Strategic Defence Review, in which I know you will be particularly interested. Our objectives in the Gulf are not only based on our historical connection and our close historical ties, but I believe are forward-looking. We seek long-term peace and stability, we seek not just to avert the next crisis. We aim for a point in the future where all the countries in the region recognise international norms of behaviour. Although we may be pulling back from the brink of a conflict at this very period, there is clearly a long way to go before reaching that desirable end state. The Strategic Defence Review, which we set in hand immediately after taking office, and which is now in its final stages, is, I believe, vital to the achievement of our long-term aims. Of course, our interests do not extend equally everywhere. Europe and NATO must obviously be a priority. Beyond Europe, we believe that our interests are most likely to be directly affected by events in the Gulf, the Near East, and North Africa. This doesn't mean, you will be reassured to know, that the review will lead to us recreating a military capability east of Suez. That would, in our view, be a retrograde step. But it does mean that the review has confirmed the importance of the Gulf region to British economic interests, the value of our bilateral ties with the Gulf states, and the importance of our wider United Nations responsibilities in the particular area of the Gulf. We must therefore be ready to respond in combination with others to support stability when it is threatened in the Gulf. This is not simply rhetoric. We gave a clear example through the Secretary of State for Defence, through the Prime Minister, of our willingness to act in practical action to illustrate our commitment in response to the crisis in Iraq earlier in the year. I made clear in the House of Commons as recently as 3 days ago in my speech during the defence debate, and in the House of Commons last October, that our interests and obligations in Europe, the Mediterranean and the Gulf would primarily determine the size and shape of our armed forces in the United Kingdom. I expect the Strategic Defence Review to introduce radical change in some key areas of defence. Our aim to produce modern forces for the modern world requires us to take the long view. I would expect these changes to meet with support from others with an interest in the Gulf and in its securities. And I believe that these changes will have implications for the structure and readiness of our forces and in our ability to project force. In the future, our forces will need that ability to deploy to meet the more diverse challenges we face. We must be better able to go to the crisis rather than expect the crisis to come to us. Now, the Joint Rapid Deployment Force, created in 1996 to provide the United Kingdom with a joint force ready to respond to a broad range of crises whenever they arise, was a step in the right direction. I have no hesitation in saying that today, since the father of the Joint Rapid Deployment Force, I think, sits with us, and his younger brother, the former Minister for the Armed Forces, is with us as well. We believe it was a step in the right direction. But for it to be properly effective, we also believe that it needs enhanced transport, it needs enhanced logistic support. We also believe that is needed together with greater firepower and better command and control. The Strategic Defence Review is addressing all of these points. We also need to break down the potentially divisive and militarily inappropriate distinction which we believe that the Joint Rapid Deployment Force drew between forces for NATO and forces for other tasks. All of this will give us much more capable joint rapid reaction forces from which we will be able better to deploy carefully tailored packages of forces at short notice anywhere in the world. Now, our objective in the Strategic Defence Review is to produce modern, flexible, high-capability forces to underpin our foreign and security policy, with equipment and technology that gives them a decisive battle-winning edge. Our armed forces will continue to make a distinctive, high-quality contribution to multinational operations to support international stability and security in the Gulf as well as elsewhere. I believe that we will produce a strong defence for the 21st century and ensure that Britain remains a force for good. The Secretary of State earlier referred to Kofi Annan's bold testament that diplomacy, when backed with force, can do more in the direction of the creation of good in the world than just diplomacy itself. And I think certainly we take with great modesty his remarks about our role as being the perfect peacekeeper as an accolade not only for the United Kingdom but for the men and women who serve in our forces and who are at the very heart of our defence effort. We will also continue to support those who are not able to counter the threat themselves. In 1991, through consultation and a unified approach against Saddam Hussein, the international coalition was able to defeat the fourth largest army in the world. Since the Gulf War, the UK security links with the GCC states have increased. We have signed or are in the process of negotiating a number of defence accords which provide for increased cooperation in a range of defence activities. Our military presence in the region has also remained at a higher level than before. It includes, as you will know, the Armilla vessels, the no-fly zones patrols in the north and in the south, substantial numbers of personnel on loan service, regular exercise programmes and visits by specialist training teams. The UK military contribution to the Western presence in the region underpins our political commitment to security in the Gulf. It is also a reflection of our broader responsibilities as a member of the Security Council. Now, one of the themes of this conference is improving cooperation and recognising the importance of working together. And so I naturally support efforts to improve cooperation within the Gulf Cooperation Council. Our own experience in NATO and within the Gulf have proven that we and our allies are more likely to form an effective deterrent if we stand shoulder to shoulder. That, I believe, is the lesson not only of the last decade, but the lesson of history this century. From the outset, the United Kingdom has been an enthusiastic supporter of the GCC. We would encourage a strong and cohesive body with collective policies and defence capability. Cooperation in the field of defence is the principal means by which the members can manage threats against their own security and play a vital part in regional stability. I would like to congratulate GCC members on the development of their armed forces, both in numbers and capability of equipment, and the skills and knowledge of military personnel. However, I would deign to suggest that in the current security environment, Western military support and a Western military presence in the region are also important. The key to deterring aggression is diplomacy backed up by the credible threat of force. Primarily, this deterrence means US military might. However, there is, I believe, a distinct and important role for the United Kingdom to play, both in political and in military terms. Our contribution is welcomed not least by the United States, who recognise our willingness to share that burden. This has given us, I believe, insight into the US decision-making process and allowed us to influence the United States security policy. The United Kingdom can also support the development of GCC forces by the provision of training and advice and by the supply of high quality and proven defence equipment. Now, this is an area where traditionally the United Kingdom has been able to make a contribution and where we remain willing to provide assistance. As the Secretary of State said earlier, those activities fit in well with our ideas about making greater use of the armed forces for defence diplomacy in the wider sphere. We also welcome the opportunity for the United Kingdom forces to train in the Gulf. Exercises demonstrate their capability to deploy to and operate in the region and therefore add to deterrence. This effect is enhanced through combined exercises with our GCC allies, which support the development of our GCC forces and the capability and ability of our forces to operate together. If I might say on a personal note, I believe that they also offer the unparalleled opportunity for people to meet people, because all the great signatures and all the great rhetorical statements of statesmen mean very little unless bonded together by the personal relationship, the working together in action, the addressing each other eye to eye, which happens on occasions where people come together. And that is the cement that bonds our historical friendship and our historical experience. And exercises, I believe, give the opportunity to apply that cement to ensure that there is a continuing strength in our relationship. The focus of this conference is, of course, Gulf security, and I'm sure that much will be said about Iraq. There is no doubt, unfortunately, that Saddam Hussein remains the major immediate threat to stability in the Gulf. In 1990, he demonstrated his ambition to dominate the region, but he has on numerous occasions and in various ways shown that he's a threat to his neighbours. We are still waiting for him to produce the evidence we need to be sure that he has destroyed all his weapons of mass destruction. Until the work of the United Nations Special Commission is complete, we believe and continue to believe that Saddam remains a threat to both regional and to international peace. As we showed in the recent crisis, we will not allow Saddam to defy the will of the international community by his resolute disregard for United Nations Security Council resolutions. The authority of the United Nations must be upheld. And whilst it is issues relating to weapons of mass destruction that makes the front pages of the newspapers in the United Kingdom, we remember that there are a range of issues in which Saddam still has to supply satisfactory answers. Prominent amongst these, the fate of those missing from Kuwait. In the recent crisis, the United Kingdom's policy of diplomacy, backed by the credible threat of military force, was clearly right and ultimately recognised as such. There was an international consensus that Saddam must comply with Security Council resolutions, and we always hoped that a diplomatic solution would be found. The British government worked hard on many fronts to support and achieve this. Since diplomacy was the preferred solution, indeed since diplomacy is always the preferred solution to a crisis, we welcomed the fact that the United Nations Secretary General's visit to Baghdad secured an agreement signed by Tariq Aziz and endorsed by Saddam Hussein, allowing unrestricted access for United Nations weapons inspectors to all sites within Iraq, without time limits, and an agreement to allow repeat inspections to presidential sites. Whilst I recognise that some were opposed to the use of military force, we believed then and do now that this was the only way that Saddam could be brought into line if he refused to comply with the wishes of the international community or chose to defy the will of the United Nations further. We have long known that Saddam only respects diplomacy when it is backed by the credible military force which is precisely why we sent a carrier and a BARC air route to the Gulf in January, followed by the deployment of RAF tornadoes to Kuwait. The credit for the successful outcome to the crisis needs to be shared by all who supported this policy, and we are grateful, immensely grateful, to all who did support and continue to support these deployments. Now, as a Defence Minister, you would expect me to focus on the part that military force, or more accurately, the threat of military force, has played in containing Iran. But this is, of course, only one of the tools at our disposal, and has to be seen in the context of a much more complex and wider-ranging response. Economic measures through the imposition of sanctions have also played a part. But I recognise, as the British government does, that sanctions have enabled Saddam to manipulate the truth and to claim a propaganda victory in saying that our policies are leading to the deaths of innocent Iraqis, and particularly innocent Iraqi children. Nothing could be further from the truth. This government has no argument whatsoever with the people of Iraq. You will know that we hosted a meeting last week to look at ways of improving the implementation of the Oil for Food scheme and ensuring that its revenues are spent on helping the Iraqi population, who have already suffered too much for far too long under the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein. So what about the future, ladies and gentlemen? We believe that for the foreseeable future, there is no realistic alternative to a policy of containment. Our longer-term objective is to see the reintegration of Iraq as a law-abiding member of the international community. I am sure that is the aim of everyone at this conference. No one here can take any satisfaction whatsoever of a nation and a country at the very cradle of civilization of the human race being excluded, as it has been, from the norms of civilized society. We look forward to the day when Iraq will be a country with which trade and normal contacts will be possible. But tragically, it will not be possible until Iraq complies in full with Security Council resolution and ceases to pose a threat to regional and to international security. This time last year, many people, including myself, were concerned that the greatest long-term threat to Gulf security came from Iran. But we have to ask, in the light of recent developments, whether this is still the case, following the unexpected election of President Khatami last year. We are certainly encouraged by the forums that President Khatami is introducing. Iran's ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention, its attempts to reduce tension with its neighbours and the West, and Iranian condemnation of terrorist attacks in Egypt and Algeria are all very encouraging, and we hope very much a step in the right direction. In the light of this, the European Union has decided to resume the European Union-Iran dialogue suspended following the Mykonos verdict in March 1997. But please be assured that we have not forgotten the past. Please be assured that we are not naive. While President Khatami is good news, genuinely good news, for Iran and the region as a whole, there are Iranian policies which remain unacceptable. Through the European Union, we will continue to maintain pressure on Iran about its attempts to acquire weapons of mass destruction and its record of support for terrorism. We have made an approach. The future of this relationship rests with Iran's response and its willingness to address our concerns and the concerns of the wider community. Together, we will watch Iran's moves closely and with interest and with hope. George Robertson, the Secretary of State, acknowledged the force of the argument that the lack of progress in the Middle East peace process made it more difficult to secure support for Western policies in the Gulf. I should make it plain this morning that this government is fully and actively committed to the search for a just and lasting peace and to promoting the development of the Palestinian news through our aid programme. One of the priorities for our European Union presidency has been to ensure that the EU continues to play an active role both in seeking to support the United States efforts and by pursuing complementary European Union activity which is both visible and credible. We and our EU partners have been working hard to establish a firm basis for progress in this area. I am sure that we are all pleased at the success of the Prime Minister's recent visit to the Middle East, particularly, of course, the agreement with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Arafat to meet Mrs. Albright here in London next week. We sincerely hope that the parties will seize this opportunity to move the peace process forward. The United States' role, of course, remains central, but the European Union stands ready to lend whatever assistance may be needed, and we in the United Kingdom have tried to show leadership through our presidency of the European Union. These are difficult issues, and I do not expect to have persuaded you that all of our policies are right, nor to have closed down the critical, though I hope optimistic view that you may take of our defence review. I will not have persuaded you this morning, nor in the course of this, that every item or every policy of the United Kingdom are right in all respects. But I do hope that I have at least reassured you that the issues of Gulf security are important to the United Kingdom, and that after the conclusion of the Strategic Defence Review, we will continue to work closely with our friends in the Gulf to tackle these issues and to contribute to the peace and security of the region. That is nothing less than would be demanded by the historical links that we have forged and by the imperatives of the present security situation in the Gulf and in the wider international community. Thank you very much.